On September 22, 1906, the cry of a newborn shattered the silence of the hospital. "You have a girl," the midwife said with a smile, looking at the young mother. "What will you name her?" "Ilse," the young mother sighed wearily. "A beautiful name," the midwife picked up. "May it bring her happiness and glory." The woman's words turned out to be prophetic. Ilse really considered herself lucky. But as for glory, yes, she would become one of the most infamously notorious figures of Nazi Germany. Her name would become known worldwide. It would become synonymous with cruelty, inhumanity, and horror. Ilse's deeds in the Buchenwald concentration camp and the subsequent trials would bring her the infamous reputation as the most ruthless woman of the Third Reich. A film would be made about her, and many articles written, but it's unlikely that this was the kind of fame Ilse's mother dreamed of. So what turned a small, ordinary girl into a merciless tormentor? A wild beast incapable of showing mercy to others? Around the name Ilse Koch, many contradictory judgments have formed, still causing debates today. For some, she is a demon, delighting in tormenting defenseless people. For others, a victim of the regime and a powerless executor of others' orders. So who was she really? A Nazi monster who adored products made of human skin, or a pawn in a deadly game? And how many nicknames did those whose lives she controlled give her? Let's try to analyze the facts, reconstruct events from nearly a century ago, and maybe find some answers. So, at the beginning of the last century, in the German Empire, in the city of Dresden, an ordinary worker and housewife had a daughter, Ilse Kohler, future Ilse Koch. The family lived modestly, but was not poor, and the daughter was raised according to the spirit of the time: strict morals, patriarchal traditions, respect for elders, and discipline. Calm and cheerful, the girl did well in school and in childhood showed no inclination toward sadism or cruelty at all. Ilse early realized that her parents could not provide her with a decent future, so she would have to achieve everything herself. Therefore, after the 8th grade, the girl entered a commercial school. After finishing it, she worked first in accounting and then got a job in a library. It's surprising that at that time, no one could have guessed that this modest, helpful girl, quietly gliding between the bookshelves, would in a few years turn into a monster. Visitors and staff at the library called the new friendly employee a sweet angel, unaware of what demons really lived inside her soul. And this merciless force gradually began to overpower the purity, faith, and kindness of the young Miss Kohler. Leaving the library, Ilse worked as a secretary in various companies. Even then, dark character traits began to show that later became especially noticeable in her behavior: a desire for power, hardness, emotional coldness. Early 1930s, Germany. The Great Depression, like a hurricane that destroyed the world economy, did not spare the Germans either. Barely recovering after the war, Germany was again on the brink of poverty, hunger, and unemployment. And here came the NSDAP, the Nationalist Party, led by Hitler, with very promising programs. It's no surprise that the youth sympathized with the rising party, willingly joining its ranks. Ilse also did not stay aside, and in 1932 became a member of the NSDAP. Now she believed only in power and authoritarian rule. By the way, Hitler did not trust women, believing their place was at the stove, not in politics. So there were not many female representatives in the party, only about 5%. But Ilse Kohler was among them. What does a woman need to be happy? Of course, to marry well. It's hard to say that Ilse was beautiful and attractive, but her proud arrogance was hard to miss. And what can bring two people closer, of course? A shared interest. What attracted Ilse to her future husband, and what interested her so much in him, is scary to imagine. But let's go in order. A couple of years after joining the party, she met Karl Otto Koch within its ranks, a divorced Standartenführer who was 9 years older than her. He, like Ilse, came from a working-class family. In the past, Karl was involved in theft and fraud and at one point even became a police informant. This was the part of his biography he never publicized. Nevertheless, he managed to join the NSDAP, and thanks to the support of party comrades, he began to rapidly climb the career ladder. Ilse and Karl liked each other almost from the first meeting. Something invisible yet common attracted them. This was clearly not love. As we will learn later, they were both devoid of such a bright feeling. By that time, Karl already held a good position as the first commandant at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. Yes, don't be surprised. World War II hadn't even started yet. But concentration camps already existed in Germany. Hitler was trying to prove to the whole world that there were no and could be no opponents to his policies in the country. Therefore, those who disagreed with the authorities were quickly sent to such a camp, where living conditions were inhuman and cruel. Sachsenhausen was one of the first camps planned to hold enemies of the Nazi regime, Jews, mentally ill people, and people with non-traditional sexual orientation. It was here that the most brutal overseers and guards were trained, who were then sent to other concentration camps as experienced specialists. So even among these scoundrels, Karl Koch gained a reputation as the most ruthless beast without moral principles. And it was these qualities that won Ilse's heart, who worked at the camp as a secretary. It seems that some dark force brought them together, which would soon reveal itself. 2 years after meeting, Ilse and Karl decided to get married. However, it turned out not to be so simple. The fact was that by that time, a special decree on marriages in Germany had been issued. The future spouses had to provide a genealogy proving their racial purity since the early 19th century. Ilse and Karl passed this test, receiving permission to marry from Himmler himself. So, Ilse marries the Nazi Koch and takes his last name. An ordinary family life begins if you don't take into account the time and events happening around them. What can sharply change a person and their attitude toward others? Some personal drama, you might say, and you would undoubtedly be right. But most often, what changes a person is the feeling of impunity and the right to control other people. Give a man power, and you will know who he is, said Napoleon Bonaparte, who once dreamed of world domination himself. From personal experience, we know these words often find confirmation in real life. As early as 1936 in Sachsenhausen, the Koch couple, feeling supported by the Nazi Party, cruelly abused prisoners with impunity. But that would turn out to be child's play compared to what they would do in Buchenwald. Established in July 1937, the Buchenwald camp was one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, not so much for political prisoners as for future POWs from captured territories. It was a place not for holding people, but for their destruction. Karl was immediately transferred to Buchenwald as camp commandant. Naturally, his loyal wife followed him. Upon arriving in Buchenwald, the Nazi Koch family gained unlimited power over the lives and fates of the prisoners. Behind the barbed wire, the sadistic tendencies of the spouses found the freedom they lacked in ordinary life. The monster living deep in the soul of the friendly Ilse understood that its time had come and with a malicious grin burst out. What would this be? Just a barbaric hobby that doesn't fit within the usual framework of human consciousness, or the first signs of a clear mental disorder provoked by Nazi ideology? Ilse fanatically tried to prove her loyalty to Hitler's party. She was married to a true German, had several children. Yes, the Nazi Party promoted that German women should have as many children as possible because every child, as Hitler himself said, is a personal gift to the Führer. That was how a woman could prove her devotion to the German people, and Ilse supported her Führer. In 1938, the family had a son, Artwin, a year later a daughter, Gisela, and another year after that, a second daughter, Gudrun. She would have another son, Uwe, born several years after Karl's death, who clearly had no relation to him. The mystery of Uwe's birth remains unsolved, but we will return to that later. Unfortunately, Ilse did not succeed in becoming a good mother and housewife, as the Hitler Party demanded, and she didn't try very hard. All the house and garden work was done by prisoners who feared the mistress more than the commandant himself. Her orders had to be executed immediately. And the children were a burden for Ilse, who often left them with her husband's relative. Gudrun, who was only 4 months old, died of pneumonia. The fate of the eldest son was also hardly happy. In 1964, he committed suicide, unable to bear the bad reputation of his parents and social condemnation. Although shortly before that, he publicly declared he condemned his mother for her deeds and wanted to distance himself from her. But that was much later. Now it is time to lift the veil of secrecy over this Nazi married couple. From the outside, it seemed like a perfectly prosperous family living in full comfort in a luxurious mansion. In reality, behind the expensive facade of a beautiful life was a stinking swamp. Besides sadistic tendencies, Karl was a supporter of homosexual male love, and male prisoners attracted him much more than his own wife. Moreover, he continued to torture prisoners, deriving immense pleasure from it. Prisoners who violated camp order were branded with hot iron, and their fingers crushed in vices. Ilse kept up with her husband with even more cruel and twisted fantasies. One of her favorite pastimes was walking around the camp accompanied by her German shepherd, which she happily set on any prisoner, especially if it was a pregnant woman or a person carrying a heavy load. The dog mercilessly tore the poor victim to the cheerful laughter of its mistress, who was excited by the sight of blood. After that, the walk continued. In the Nazi woman's hands was always a whip with pieces of razor blade. She mercilessly struck anyone who crossed her path. Ilse also loved riding around the camp on horseback, and her favorite whip was always in her hands. Guess whose backs bore the bloody marks? Of course, not her beloved horse's back, but this was only the beginning of her amusements. Then she invented humiliating, almost absurd tasks. For example, forcing people to clean camp paths with toothbrushes. She demanded that it would be done within a strictly set time frame, which was practically impossible. As you've guessed, no one managed to finish on time, so Ilse took immense pleasure in delivering whiplashes. For this, she was nicknamed the Beast of Buchenwald. Why did the camp commandant's wife get a dog nickname? How did this ugly woman draw the attention of male prisoners? Very simply. Ilse loved mocking the prisoners, exhausted by hunger and hard labor. Wearing a rather short skirt or a provocative tight dress, she would stroll around the campgrounds, fully aware that natural instinct would take over sooner or later. And as soon as she noticed someone looking at her, what she considered an appraising glance, that person would immediately face punishment. In general, Ilse constantly complained about the prisoners to her husband, the commandant, knowing what would follow. And she could do anything. While Karl enjoyed sex with male prisoners, Ilse found herself another amusement. Barely noticing a good-looking young prisoner, she would demand that he be brought to her for sexual pleasures. This woman forcibly made men fulfill any of her sexual whims. The fact that she was married didn't bother her at all. Her husband had his living toys, and she had hers. Sometimes Ilse got tired of having sex herself, and then she forced prisoners to pleasure each other right before her eyes. She didn't care at all whether they were men or women. For this, she was called the Bitch of Buchenwald. Very soon, rumors began to spread among the camp staff that Ilse was a nymphomaniac, and her marriage to Karl was just a cover. Ilse had lovers among the camp guards and doctors. It is still unknown whether her son Artwin and daughter Gisela were actually Karl Koch's children. Karl himself was indifferent to his wife's antics, possibly having no intimate relationship with her at all lately. Because soon he would be diagnosed with syphilis, while Ilse showed no sign of this sinful disease. However, the status of being the commandant's wife allowed her to feel above everyone else. She reveled in power, feeling like an all-powerful goddess who ruled anyone's fate with impunity. The humiliation, pain, and fear of others brought her perverse satisfaction. Ilse took pleasure in watching the emotional suffering of the people being led to the gas chambers, but most of all, she liked it when children died. According to surviving prisoners, Ilse trembled with excitement when she saw children going to death. The prisoners gave her another nickname that fully reflected this woman's rotten inner world, the Witch of Buchenwald. Soon, even the guards, who sometimes suffered at the hands of Ilse and her husband, began calling her that. But the worst was yet to come. What confirms the status of a luxurious lady? Of course, her accessories, especially handbags and gloves. Once, at a Christmas party organized for SS officers and their wives, Ilse, who always loved expensive things, showed off a beautiful handbag with an amazing red monkey pattern. Without any shame, she told the stunned guests that both the handbag and the delicate gloves were made by her personally from human skin. She forgot to add that the skin was literally torn off from a still half-alive person. Unlike other sadist doctors, Ilse was not interested in medical experiments. She was more attracted to decorative and applied arts, and to be more precise, to leather products, and even more precisely, made from human skin. According to former Buchenwald prisoners, Ilse Koch showed a special interest in inmates with tattoos as soon as they appeared in the camp's dungeons. Riding by on her horse or just walking around, she would carefully examine people. As soon as she noticed a tattoo on a prisoner's body, the woman would become delighted and order that prisoner to be taken to the camp hospital for another medical examination. No one ever saw that tattooed person again. What happened in the hospital rooms? People with weak nerves better not know. If Ilse liked the image, the unfortunate person was given a lethal injection. Shooting was absolutely forbidden, just in case the bullet damaged the tattoo. Then the skin was removed from the person like from an animal and sent to tanning specialists, who were also prisoners, by the way. Sometimes it happened that at that moment, Ilse could not find the tattoo she wanted. What to do then? Wait for a new batch of prisoners, but that would take too long, and there was no guarantee that tattoos would be right. Ilse found a way. She would find a young man with beautiful skin and force another prisoner to make the necessary tattoo. As soon as the image on the unfortunate person's skin became what Ilse wanted, the prisoner was sent to the hospital, from which he never returned. According to witnesses in such moments, the Witch of Buchenwald simply shone with delight. However, some sources claim that Ilse searched for tattooed people not only for herself, but also for the camp doctor Hoven, who was one of her lovers. The doctor was writing a dissertation about the connection between crime and tattoos. Maybe that's true. Unfortunately, all the evidence was later destroyed, but more on that later. Here we need to pause and catch our breath, because what happened next with this material simply cannot be comprehended by civilized people. What did Frau Koch do with the tattooed skin? She personally made necessary items from it: gloves and handbags, tablecloths, and book covers, and once inviting her girlfriends, the overseer's wives, to her house, she showed off a surprisingly beautiful lamp. At first, the friends sighed with envy, looking at the luxury, but then were horrified when they learned what it was made of: a lamp made from a shin bone with a lampshade made of human skin. However, none of the overseers refused such gifts. For her creepy obsession, Ilse earned yet another nickname among the prisoners and even among her friends: Frau Lampshade. By the way, Ilse Koch had quite a few nicknames, each reflecting a certain aspect of her brutal nature. Besides the ones already known, she was also called the Red Witch, for her special attention to tattoos done in red ink, and the Butcher's Widow. Soon, Ilse's hobby reached complete madness. She even sewed herself underwear made from the skin of murdered prisoners. A special joy was brought to her by prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, Russia, among whom there were often people with tattoos in the form of stars, church domes, or even the Soviet emblem. These prisoners were killed just a couple of days after arriving in Buchenwald, but the true cause of their death was concealed. Ilse was helped in this by Dr. Erich Wagner. He, under her orders, forged documents indicating, for example, died of a heart attack. The exact number of her victims is impossible to determine. Most likely there were hundreds. Some prisoners, not wanting to become a lampshade in Koch's house or a tablecloth on her table, cut their own skin, disfiguring their tattoos. They clearly understood that after this they would face the gas chamber, but preferred to die there. And Frau Lampshade's appetite kept growing. Besides her obsession with human skin, Ilse Koch began collecting body parts of prisoners. Later, dried human heads and preserved organs such as lungs, brain, and liver were found in her collection. Some of them were experimented on, but most served as creepy decorations for her home and the homes of the guards. Some of these terrible exhibits were quite well preserved, which later allowed them to be used as evidence in trials. And yet everything comes to an end. The first warning of the coming storm was Commandant Koch's transfer from Buchenwald to the Majdanek concentration camp in 1941. It started with Ilse often bragging about souvenirs made of skin and expensive purchases. Soon the leadership took an interest. The Koch spouses were detained and tried for excessive cruelty and moral corruption. Can you imagine how terrible the things were that the Kochs did in Buchenwald if even the Nazis arrested them? Killing and torturing people was routine for the Hitlerites, but to take pleasure in it. The fascists really didn't want the world to think of them as sadists. That's the first thing. Secondly, the Wehrmacht criminal police became interested in the mass death of people in Buchenwald from starvation from 1938 to 1941. During inspections, food fraud was discovered, especially with meat. It turned out that the SS officers took the good products meant for the camp prisoners. They threw parties and sent luxurious packages to their families. Prisoners, however, were fed products of disgusting quality, even though documents marked them as premium goods. Commandant Karl Koch supervised this. Besides that, the police chief accused Koch of corruption and enrichment at the expense of prisoners' property. But this time, Karl and Ilse managed to avoid punishment. They convinced the prosecution that they were simply slandered by jealous rivals. Moreover, no evidence was found. Maybe the guards involved in this case hid the evidence, or maybe they didn't look for it at all. There are reports that Himmler's intervention played a big role in Koch's release, issuing an order that no SS member holding a high position can be arrested without his personal order. The Koch couple was released from prison, but Karl was transferred to work at another camp. Ilse stayed in Buchenwald and breathed a sigh of relief, but as it turned out, only briefly. The police chief turned out to be a real meticulous German and decided to finish the Koch case. For more than a year, he studied documents from Buchenwald and found that all the accusations against this family were not baseless. Why were Karl Koch and his wife arrested again? And how did Ilse avoid severe punishment again? Let's start with the fact that besides their sexual interests, the sadist family loved money very much. When prisoners arrived at the camp, all their belongings were confiscated: money, jewelry, valuables, and even dental gold. The Nazis reasoned that those sentenced to death didn't need them. However, these trophies were supposed to be handed over to the Reich or used for camp needs. Only Ilse and Karl systematically appropriated most of these goods for themselves. Prisoners' money disappeared into personal safes. Ilse constantly changed expensive outfits and jewelry, and the good horseback riding arena built at her request clearly wasn't cheap. The meticulous police chief found all this out, and one more circumstance greatly interested him. While going through concentration camp papers, he came across two very well-known prisoners, Doctors Walter Kremer and his assistant. They served in Buchenwald's infirmary and often treated even SS members. documents recorded that the doctors were shot while trying to escape back in November 1941. But why would they need to escape? They lived quite well in the camp. Could it be that they were eliminated because they treated Koch for syphilis and might have known not only about his fraud, but something even more terrible? After comparing all the facts and getting Himmler's permission, Karl Koch and his wife were arrested again in 1943. Their family accounts were immediately checked, and a considerable fortune was found which Karl couldn't explain to investigators. And if the SS leadership calmly tolerated cruel abuses of prisoners, they could not allow theft and fraud against the Reich. The Koch family was charged with personal enrichment, causing economic damage to Germany, and physically eliminating witnesses of their crimes. In Nazi Germany, such offenses were punished very severely. At this time, rumors about the items made from human skin that Frau Koch was obsessed with surfaced again. Their villa was searched, but surprisingly, no lampshades, albums made of skin, or handbags were found. Perhaps they were well hidden by Ilse herself or destroyed by her assistants. But a jewelry box with expensive jewelry and a safe with money were found, which only confirmed the fraud. In the case of Karl Otto Koch, Ilse was considered an accomplice, but after spending 16 months in prison, she was released. It turned out that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence. The camp chaplain, who knew everything about the atrocities of the Koch couple and had agreed to testify, unexpectedly died a few days before the trial. As it was later revealed, the cause of his death was potassium cyanide. It's not hard to guess who helped silence the chaplain forever, and Ilse, barely out of prison, took her children and went to live with relatives in a town 500 kilometers from Berlin. Soon she would become a widow. Her husband, SS Standartenführer Karl Otto Koch, would be executed despite all his protests. This happened on April 5, 1945, in the courtyard of Buchenwald, the very camp where not long ago he and his wife decided who would live and who would die. A few days later, Buchenwald would be liberated by American soldiers who would be horrified by what they saw and heard. Piles of human bodies, not yet cremated, half alive, emaciated people. But even more terrifying were the survivors' stories about the atrocities of the Koch family. To confirm this, a horrifying collection was found in the guard's house. Human organs carefully placed in glass jars and tied with ribbons like festive gifts. These finds, along with survivors' testimonies, became part of the charges, and in July 1945, Ilse Koch was arrested by American military. On April 11, 1947, she appeared in court again. However, Ilse did not admit to any of the charges. She claimed she never entered the campgrounds and never possessed items made from human skin. Indeed, those items had mysteriously disappeared. But testimonies from many former prisoners proved otherwise, and the Witch of Buchenwald suddenly realized what punishment awaited her. And dying at 40 was definitely not something she wanted. How to avoid the death penalty? What must be done to soften the sentence? Women have one simple way to get pregnant, but how to do that in solitary confinement? Even here, Ilse managed to find a way out. At the Buchenwald trial, she was already in late pregnancy, which helped her receive a life sentence instead of execution. Who was Ilse expecting the child from? There are several theories on this question. One theory says she got pregnant by a German soldier who managed to get to her cell through an underground tunnel. Another, more realistic version suggests that the father could have been Ilse's lawyer or one of their guards. There was even a very unlikely story that friends passed her a capsule with sperm during a visit, which Frau Ilse then introduced with her finger. Whatever the case, this child saved her life. And 4 years later, American General Lucius Clay caused an international scandal by releasing Ilse Koch due to lack of evidence. The souvenirs made of skin were never found. However, shortly after her release from American prison, She was arrested again by German authorities and returned behind bars. Now she was tried by the Germans. The sentence remained the same: life imprisonment. She would never be freed again. In 1951, Ilse was transferred to the women's prison in Eichach, Bavaria. Her mental state worsened year by year. She could sit silently for hours in deep depression, or, on the contrary, pace her cell in fits of hysteria. Over the years, Ilse lost more and more contact with reality. She began to see shadows of the people she had tortured everywhere. They came with curses and threatened heavenly punishment. Some of them demanded their skin back. As you've probably guessed, Frau Koch simply went insane. On September 1st, 1961, she wrote a farewell letter to her son and hanged herself with bedsheets in her cell. In her will, she asked to be buried in an unmarked grave, which was done. In 1971, her son Uwe, born to Ilse in prison, tried to restore his mother's name, considering her a victim of the system. But he was not even heard. Ilse Koch remained in history as a symbol of Nazi inhumanity, reminding us how easily one can lose their humanity when given unchecked power over others. Her personality, thanks to journalists, became surrounded by so many rumors that it's hard to separate fiction from truth. But it is certain that this woman was a real monster, crueler than even many men. The worst part is that until the very end, she never repented what she had done. A being who was supposed to give life instead destroyed it. But was she a monster from the very beginning, or did the monster awaken in her when it became allowed? By the way, in 2020 in Poland, a German album with a leather cover was purchased on the black market. Hair and a tattoo were visible on it. Experts at the Auschwitz Museum, where the album was sent, established that the cover was made from the skin of a Buchenwald prisoner. Isn't this one of Frau Lampshade's works? And how many more such gifts are still kept in private collections?